Now, what we'll do is we'll try to explain why the supply curve slopes upwards. So what happens is, in case of a demand curve, we see that the demand curve is negatively sloped, and hence it's essentially downward sloping. The reverse logic applies when we are talking about supply curve. So the answer to the supply curve being upwards sloping, upward moving, essentially refers to the law of supply. So here there's kind of a little same story going on. In case of demand, we justify the downward sloping portion of the demand curve to be to be a result of the law of demand, which exhibits a negative relationship between price and quantity demanded. And in case of supply, we justify the upward slope of the supply curve using the law of supply, which justifies the positive relationship between quantity supplied of a good and the price of the good. So that is what I essentially put here. The claim, essentially the law of supply is a claim that other things being equal, again, this is a very important statement, other things being equal, the quantity supplied of a good rises when the price of their good rises. So that is what I essentially mean when I talk about law of supply. That's very common. If you see that the price of a particular good rises, as a producer, as a seller of that good, you will find that it gives you more profit, it earns you more revenue in a fact. And what you'll do is, if there's a higher price going on of a commodity, you will supply more of that good. You'll obviously want to maximize your profits and maximize your revenue, and that is what you'll be doing. So when the quantity supplied of a good rises, we can usually assume that the price of that good is rising. Of course, it's usually the case. Of course, we have exceptions, and we will be talking about them in our future videos, but let's say that the law of supply holds for the time being. So we'll just check it once again, the same way we did in case of demand. So yeah, as you can see, the price of that good keeps on falling, as I have mentioned before, and the quantity supplied of the good falls as well. And since there's a positive relationship, so the arrows face in the same direction, unlike the case that we had in case of demand. Since there's a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied per month, there's a positive relationship. Essentially, what we mean is this angle, the angle between the horizontal axis and the supply curve, is essentially a positive angle. So when we are talking about lines like this, essentially this angle is a negative angle and this angle is a positive angle. So that is a mathematical interpretation of the entire concept. So this is how we explain the shape of the supply curve. Now again, supply curve also has the same concept that we had in case of demand. So what I can do is, using the summation of the individual supply curves of each producer in a market, I can find out the market supply curve. So just as market demand curve is the sum of all the demands of buyers, market supply is the sum of the supplies of all sellers. So we can, kind of connect this with the demand concepts that we have discussed before. Again, the market supply is the horizontal sum of all the individual supplies for a particular good or service. So we have discussed the horizontal sum concept before in the demand concept. So kind of remains the same. So the logic more or less remains the same. So we'll be just looking at a small diagram to, recollect what we had discussed in case of demand. So here we have two individuals, A, and we have individual B. So again, we assume that the market is composed of only two producers in this case, not consumers, since we are talking about supply. So we assume that there are only two producers in the market, or two sellers in the market, seller A and seller B. And what I do is, I have the supply curve of these two individuals. So I have an upward sloping supply curve for producer A and an upward sloping supply curve for producer B, which pertains to the law of supply. So there's a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied of the good. And what I'm interested in is finding out the market supply. So I'm interested in finding out the relationship between the price that persists in a market and the total amount of a particular commodity that a combined group of essentially A and B explains. So what I do is, as you can see, at a price point of 4, both A and B are supplying 0 units of the commodity. So essentially, quantity is measured in the horizontal axis. So when I'm talking about the quantity demanded, I essentially try to find out the distance between that particular point on the vertical axis pertaining to the relevant price point that I'm talking about and the line itself. So since the line essentially is basically like this, so if the supply curve starts from here, then essentially it has a vertical intercept. So at price point of 4, and similarly the producer B also has a vertical intercept such as this. So at a price point of 4, you can see that the supply curve is essentially coinciding with the vertical axis, which essentially means that there is zero, null, or no difference between the vertical axis and the supply curve. So at a price point of 4, both producer A and producer B are interested in selling 0 units to the market. So that is what I have. So there's the distance between the market supply curve and the vertical axis is 0 in case of market. So that satisfies. When we are talking about a price point of 8 units, the individual A is willing to sell 30 units of good to the market. So when we move to B's supply curve, what we essentially see is at a price point of 8 units, B is willing to supply 0 units. So if we make a horizontal sum, that is, we add up the horizontal distance between the vertical axis and the supply curve for both producer A and producer B, what we find is A is willing to produce 30 units, or A is willing to sell 30 units, and B is willing to sell 0, null, or no units. So what we do is we essentially add 30 plus 0, and what we find is we are plotting 30 units on the market demand curve. So this point is essentially meant to correspond to this direction essentially. And what we find is essentially at the price point of 8 units, the market is willing to sell 0 to 30 units. So the market will be selling 30 units of goods or commodities to the market. Similarly, when we move further up the price point, at a price of $12, producer A is willing to sell, let's say, 60 units of good, and at the same price point, producer B is willing to sell about 15 units of the good. So that's 60 plus 15, which is 75. So at a price point of 12, you see it's essentially a little above 60. So the producer is willing to sell about 75. That is not exactly to scale 75, but that is the basic concept. In fact, that is the same procedure in which we had found out the horizontal summation of the individual demand curves in case of demand. So when we were talking about demand, the horizontal summation of the individual demand curves gave us the market demand curve, and in the same way, the horizontal summation of the individual supply curves of each of the consumers or each of the producers, will give me the market supply curve. So that is how the market supply curve is derived. Now, the next thing that we'll be talking about is the shifts of the supply curve. So we had already discussed the shifts of the demand curve, and now we'll be talking about the shifts of the supply curve. The essential concept remains the same. So because the market supply curve is drawn holding other things constant, so in my definition also I had mentioned that ceteris paribus condition. So the ceteris paribus condition was there in case of law of demand as well. This ceteris paribus condition essentially means that other things remain constant. So when we are considering the set par condition that other things remain constant, one of the factors might change. And when one of the factors changes, not just the entire supply curve itself shifts location. So it can move to the left or it can shift to the right. Essentially, there's a shift of the supply curve. So look at this diagram that I have here. So I'm not going to go into the details because we had explained the concept of changes in or shifts in the demand curve. So the basic concept remains the same. Essentially, when there are changes in the set par conditions, the supply curve shifts. So as you can see here, the main supply curve is S, and at the same price ratio, so at the same price point of $3,000, there might be a situation when the supply curve shifts to the right, and that is an outward shift essentially, and the supply curve shifts to a new S1 curve. So initially, when at a price point of $3,000, 5 million goods were supplied to the market. Then after the supply curve shifts outwards or shifts rightward, at the same price point of $3,000, 6 million goods are supplied to the market. Similarly, when the supply curve shifts inward, that is leftward, at a price point of 3,000, which is the same as the initial case, the quantity supplied in the market reduces to 4 million. So that is how the shifts essentially occur. So again, you can do the same for other price points as well. So initially, this was the amount sold in the market, millions, of course, when the price point was $5,000. So when the supply curve shifts, the quantity demanded or the quantity supplied increases, and for a inward or a leftward shift, the quantity supplied decreases at the same price point. So this is a very important aspect. When I'm talking about this same supply curve, price changes, but other things don't remain constant. And essentially, the individual moves along the supply curve, or in case of demand, along the demand curve. But when I'm talking about shifts, the entire supply curve, or in case of demand, the entire demand curve shifts, the prices essentially remain constant. So at the same price, there are changes or there are differences in the quantity demanded or supply. So that is how the shifts in the supply curve happen.